Hey everyone, it's Peter from Daydream Nation, and I've got two of my favorite panelists back to the channel. I've got Pete Jones. How are you, my friend?
Well, good to see both of you.
Absolutely. And Reed Little from the Contrarians. How are you, Reed?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the invite. Here to talk
Absolutely.
about one of my favorite singers again.
Absolutely. We are going to talk about the 1985 concept album, Phenomena. So this was the brainchild of Tom Galley, brother of Mel Galley, putting together a little bit of a Deep Purple White Snake family supergroup of sorts. It was centered around the lead singer being Glenn Hughes. You had artists like Richard Bailey from Magnum, who was the keyboardist, Cozy Powell and Ted McKenna on drums. You also had Mel Galley on guitar and a wealth of other guest artists on this album. Now, this album per se is a concept album based on a science fiction horror story. I don't know, Pete or Reed, if you've read the synopsis. I'm not even going to bother to sort of analyze what it was, but this was a project that they wanted to create some sort of a multimedia type event, and it was going to lead into a film, a concert series, but it had never eventuated. So, what we're going to do in this show is we're going to talk about our knowledge of this album, if any, in the day, and we'll do a little bit of a deep dive, spotlight songs, and at the end of the show, as we always do, we give a bit of a 2024 synopsis of what we think of the album. So, Pete, I'll throw it to you. Did you have any knowledge of this particular project, the Phenomena album?
No, I didn't. I had seen the album cover. And the reason I had seen the album cover because it was in the discount bin when I took over as the audio buyer for a big CD store in the late 80s. It's hard to not remember that cover. It's just kind of sticks in your head. It's kind of ordinary and plain as it is. It's not easy to forget. So no, I didn't. I've never heard any of this prior to our assignment. I did have some inclination that some of the people that I'm fans of that you mentioned are in it. But other than that, I have no history with this whatsoever.
This was on the bronze label in the UK, reached 63 in the UK charts, but didn't chart anywhere around the world. But apparently it did sell close to 1 million units worldwide. So that's interesting. Reed, did you have any knowledge of this concept album?
Not in the 80s. If they were exposed in the US at all, they were not played on MTV, which was how I got my popular music at the time, especially 1985. I was in high school. I was watching probably 8 hours of MTV a day because that was the only way I got exposure to the outside world from our little town in Montana. And I never, ever heard of this. In fact, I did not hear of them until 2020 when they released a compilation album called Still the Night. And because I'm a Glenn Hughes semi-completionist, I acquired that album. And in fact, until preparing for the show, I thought that was the album we were going to do because I thought it was the only album they had. And then I went, oh no, this is actually an album from 1985. So yeah, it's fair to say I had no clue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my knowledge was it was a cover story in Kerrang magazine, which I used to enjoy buying weekly at the local news agents in the 80s. It was one of my favorite magazines, and they did a whole story. This was really going to be a big thing, and they gave it a very favorable review. And I sort of bought it semi in the day, and it's been in my record collection ever since. If you want to see the show that I did with Pete Jones about the Deep Purple studio albums, I ranked it pretty highly. So, but yeah, huge fan of Glenn Hughes. Probably not as much a completist as you are, Mr. Little, but I'm certainly got a lot of Glenn Hughes in the record collection, and and White Snake, and you just look at the all-star cast on this, Cosy Powell, Don Airey, whatnot. I had to get it, and it's been with me ever since. So what we might do, just to get things going, is we'll start spotlighting songs and we'll just go round robin. So Pete Jones, do you want to pick a song and we can just take it from there?
Yeah, and for me, I have to start at the very beginning because that's the first track I heard in this endeavor, and it kind of set the overall tone for me. I will say, without too much hesitation or reservation, this was a very difficult listen for me. I found it challenging on a lot of levels. Not really knowing anything about the backstory or what it was intended for, my big first question was, who is this aimed at? What was the intent of this record? Because I'm having a hard time finding a direction with it, where it was supposed to go to, who was the intended audience here. And when we talk about the opening track, Kiss of Fire, the first thing I note is that this is the only track where Glenn has a co-writing contribution on here. Other than that, he is strictly vocals, and I think he plays bass on 2 tracks. But he is not involved in the writing on this at all. It's like you said, it's the Galleys. And so when I was listening to it, my first thoughts are, well, Glenn's got such a great voice. What a beautiful tone. But it's so steeped in deep reverb and echo. It's very recessed. And when the drums came in, I was almost certain that I had a bad version of it. So I went to multiple sources and then even found the high-res download of it, and I was like, no, this is what it sounds like. And I was really kind of surprised. The drums are so sanctioned. They're so neutered. There are no cymbal crashes. The fills are like almost non-existent. His hi-hat is barely being used. It is just more of a kind of a simple straight quarter note. And I have no problem with simple, but it just doesn't have any life. It just doesn't go anywhere. I don't feel like it has any energy, or, life is the best word I could use. It's, the keys are very predominant. They're a little forward for me in the mix. There's good guitar playing. I didn't have any problem with that, and I certainly respect all these musicians. They're very high on my list of guys that I love. But I just finished that first track going, it sounds really dated. And I almost felt it was almost more demo quality than it was finished product. And that threw me with the people that were on it and what I was maybe expecting to hear when it started. So that was kind of a rough start for me on this one.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Reed, do you want to do a counterpoint or a reply?
No, I kind of agree with most of that. And I want to kind of set my personal stage here because I like to, when I look at the songs, I look at them in order of the track list. And my initial comments are going to be a little negative, but I do actually like this album, and we will get to the part where we talk about the things I like on it. So I don't want people starting off just thinking that I hate this music. But again, not having been exposed to it in 1985, I think you do really have to be careful with the expectations that you come to this album, because you look at it and you think Cozy Powell and Neil Murray as the rhythm section, it's going to have this particular feel. Well, it does not. And it's got, on this album, you've got Mel Galley from Trapeze and Whitesnake, and you've got John Thomas from Budgie, and you think, oh, well, the guitars are going to have this feel, and they do not. So if you're expecting this kind of uber 1980s hard rock sound, which is what it looks like on paper,
right,
and you get a very different product, you get this real sense of what am I listening to. And I will also say Magnum is another band that has almost no market penetration in the United States. When people, they have like 20 albums out. I mean, they've been around forever. And I had never heard an album of theirs until a couple of years ago. And that's despite being an active member of the hard rock community for years and years. So I didn't even know the keyboardist was the keyboardist from Magnum. But he is the most prominent musician on all of these songs. And it's pretty obvious that the songs are soundtrack songs. And it reminded me very much of the last video I did with you on the album by Tony Carey, where I kept thinking this sounds like a soundtrack, which is not a criticism. It's just an observation. In the 1980s and up until the late 90s, soundtracks were huge business for the movies. So, but this is the soundtrack to something that was never made. But it feels like not just a movie soundtrack. It feels more like a stage show where Glenn is the singing lead in this stage show. And by the way, Pete, I need to correct one thing. Glenn does not write on the opening track. It's the second track he writes. I don't think he has a write on.
Yep. My bad. Still the Night. My fault. Good correction. Thank you.
So we're going to Still the Night for my pick, the song I want to discuss. And this is, I don't know what it is about this song. I own 3 versions of this song that Glenn recorded. So he wrote it with Pat Thal and put it on the, Hughes Thrall, Pat Thrall. It's with an R, right? Pat Thrall. Mm-hmm. So it's on Hughes Thrall, which is the original version. 2 years later, it shows up on Phenomena. And then a few years after that, he does it on John Norum's album, Face the Truth. So it's a good song. It's a fine song, but I don't know why out of all of the material that Glenn has ever written, this is the song that he has chosen to do multiple times. And it doesn't fit the theme of the concept in any way. So we're starting off, for me, with a song that I instantly recognize because I'm very familiar with the Hughes Thrall song. I was like, oh, I've heard this song before. Oh, except they've taken away the guitars and it's way keyboard heavy. So it's a very different arrangement with almost exactly the same vocal by Glenn. You have to, if you've ever read Glenn's autobiography or just know anything about Glenn, these were the years that he was absolutely at his worst as a human being. He was deep in his addiction. He was starting to do crack in addition to, higher dollar cocaine. And despite that, he still sings like a freaking angel. He sounds amazing on this record. And I always think, how could anybody so low, who's, his mind was gone, his physicality was being destroyed by his substance abuse, and he still sings so well. It's absolutely incredible. But I once again, I don't know why they put this track on this album. It doesn't fit in with any of the rest of the songs. But it's a good song, and it's a good rendition. It is a more keyboard heavy rendition, that's the story of this album. The keyboards are the primary instrument. And I don't know how much of that had to do with Mel Galley, his injury, because I couldn't find exactly when all of these things happened. Wikipedia just says this album was recorded sometime between 1983 and 85, right, which is pretty non-specific. And sometime in that, I think in 84, Mel had his right hand destroyed in screwing around with John Sykes in Germany, and then they botched the surgery to repair it, and he couldn't play for a couple of years. So I don't know how much is him playing on this album and how much is John Thomas.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research, and it's very hard to actually find out who played on what, other than you've got a sort of a list of musicians on a particular song. So I concur with that. Kiss of Fire, Pete Jones, Gambler.
Yeah,
It sounds
absolutely.
exactly the same. I played one after
Yep.
the other, and
Yep.
even though Kiss of Fire was written by Tom Galley and Richard Bailey, it's like, hey, brother, you don't mind if I steal a lick?
Right.
Very,
It's
very similar.
so close. It's almost
Yep.
hypocrisy.
You know how they do mashups on YouTube? You could probably do a mashup between
Yeah.
those two songs. There's a
Yeah.
challenge, folks. Put it out. That's great. Um, I agree with you, Reed. I take this and absorb this album as a soundtrack album. I don't mind the keyboards because that was sort of the era of that full-on synth atmospheric type of music. I like it. The thing that I like about this album is Glenn Hughes's voice. I treat this as a vocal album, and maybe the musicianship and whatever's happening secondary. It's the Glenn Hughes vocals because I think this has got some of Glenn Hughes' finest vocal performances against all odds. And you know, in his biography or autobiography, and he was talking about all the things, all the shenanigans that was happening in the 80s. It's a miracle that he was ever able to lay down tracks. He doesn't have a very fond memories of this experience. He said that he will never sing in a Phenomena concert. There is some suspicion that he wasn't overly compensated for his work on this. This project actually lost money. So Tom Galley lost a lot of money on it. I think he mortgaged his house, and it didn't perform very well because the Bronze label went into receivership. So the Bronze label really only had one commercial viable act, and that was Motorhead. And the rest of the acts that were on that label didn't do so well, and it was kind of mismanaged. So if this was on Warner Brothers or CBS or something else, it may have been a different story. I don't mind the keyboards in this album, and they're all the way through. The song that I want to spotlight, and maybe you guys want to pick up the thread, is Dance with the Devil. I like that folk lilt to it, the fiddles. The fiddle player is Nick Saunders. And again, I just love Glenn's vocals and the backup vocals of Pete Green and Alison McGuinness. So I love the little classical interludes. There's a little bit of classic, a little bit of gothic, but on this particular song, it's got that nice little folk lilt with a synthesizer pattern or a sequencer, and it just drives the song along. And look, I agree with you, Pete. There's a lot of reverb, and Cozy Powell's drums. You don't have that crash bang wallop of your Rainbows or MSG, but I think there's definitely a template on this album that they wanted to make it a AOR radio friendly, but it wasn't ever to be because of Bronze label, and it just, the album sank with a stone. So Dance with the Devil. Pete, do you want to do a counterpoint to that?
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of segue with what Reed said up into what you said, because we look at the second track, and not only, and I certainly defer to Reed's expertise on subject matter as to how it doesn't relate to the larger context. I just know that sonically, when they switch over to Ted McKenna, the whole song sounds like it's recorded, other than the extra reverb, in a completely different scenario. And if we're looking at a wide range of recording, again, a 2-year period, that makes sense because sonically they sound totally different. If Cozy's performances had more of the Ted production to them, Ted's drums are cleaner. You can hear his fills more. You can actually hear some crashes that actually accent phrases and downbeats and things like that kind of make a song move along structurally. It would probably be a little bit better. And as we get to Dance with the Devil, I felt the exact same thing. Nobody loves to drive a shuffle more than Mr. Powell. But he's driving a car that has no engine, and the analogy that I used is he's the Bumble without his teeth. He's just not scary anymore. He's now everybody's friend. Look, we have a pet Bumble, and it's an expectation. Yes. Even in some of these other side projects, and Cozy's done a lot of them, you could always tell it was Cozy. He always found a way to have his true style come through. Even when the little kind of predictable double bass comes in, it's certainly not any impact. It's just like, oh, okay, there's some double bass, and then right back to the standard feel and groove. It's a shame, and there's a lot of records that I've heard over time that are like this, that you've got Glenn, who, like we said, remarkable that he's functioning at this level, is so outshining his material. And for me, that's hard to listen to. He's so good, but he is getting no help. And he's got no support. It's just him. And that's just a testament to how incredible he is as a talent and as a singer, that he can carry things like that. And I will say that I do enjoy the backing tracks, the vocals. I do like the accompanied backing vocals. I think they're strong and they're well done. And that gives it a little more melodic sense to listening. But I don't think the instrumentation is really helping them. And I find it interesting because, Mel is credited in a lot of these too as co-writer, and Mel is not a shabby writer. We look at the tracks that are on Slide It In. And of course, in the show that you and I did, it's my highest ranking Whitesnake record. Gambler, Love Ain't No Stranger, Give Me More Time, All or Nothing, and Spit It Out are all tracks that he co-wrote on Slide It In '83. So he knows how to write. The question is how much of a contribution was it? Who's really driving the ship? And I do think that it is his brother almost exclusively, I think, if I was a fly on the wall. And so I just don't think that the songs are reaching up to where Glenn is. Glenn's on a level here, and he's almost singing subpar material, which gives me an unsettledness. But it's a different feel. It's got some good melodic parts to it, but it's kind of a difficult listen to for my first kind of run throughs. And I've probably heard this about a dozen times now at this point, all the way through. I don't stop. I don't skip tracks. I put it away. I come back, but I've probably listened to it about a dozen times, and I'm kind of getting the same reaction with each one. So I'm wondering if I'm not too far off where my bass sense is on these tracks. So,
all right. Couple of questions. What do you think of the fiddle arrangement? Because there's a mournful fiddle sound all the way through it. Do you like that?
I do. It's one of the highlights of the track. It's perfectly balanced in the mix. It's got momentum. And I can hear it right now. And I would suggest that if they had stripped this down and we could take the backing tracks and play just the fiddle and Glenn with some backing vocals, I would really enjoy this. I think I would really, because there's elements of it that I think work. When you add in the other things, all of a sudden it kind of takes this weird diversion that it just doesn't seem to fit. So there are elements of it, but yes, I enjoyed his fiddle playing quite a bit. And I think that worked with Glenn's and with the backing vocals.
All right. Instrumentation and arrangement aside, what about as a song? Do you like the song?
First impressions, not so much.
Okay.
And I don't know, to be honest, how that'll change, because Reed really pointed it out, because I'm looking at it only in 2024 years after decades and decades of following some of these people, and some of which are immense heroes, especially Cozy. I just kind of shook my head. I'm puzzled.
Yeah. And thirdly, can Glenn Hughes sing the phone book and you'd still be entertained?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question.
Yeah, there you go.
There's never been a problem with Glenn can sing. That's never been an issue.
Yeah.
I so want somebody to do a video where they get their favorite singer to actually sing a phone book. I just think that would be hilarious.
Right. He'd be in my top 3, I tell you. He'd be
so I want to throw down on this song because Dance with the Devil actually is my favorite track on this album. It has the most movement. It has the most kind of joy and buoyancy to it. I normally don't go in for fiddle in a rock context, but I think it's great. I think it provides the most sonic interest on this entire album. It's a happy song. It weirdly reminds me of Rainbow with Joe Lynn Turner with the song Fire Dance off of the album Bent Out of Shape. If you added fiddle to Fire Dance, it would be very much like this. Or if you took Richie and had him play on Dance with the Devil, it would be very similar. And in fact, kind of my overall, if somebody just asked me, what does this album sound like? I would say it's Rainbow with ambient synths instead of Hammond organ.
Yeah.
Except less guitar. And again, I just have to wonder how much of that is because Mel literally couldn't play. He did get his ability to play back, apparently, with the creation of an artificial device called the Claw, which allowed him to hold a pick again. But that wasn't an instantaneous thing. I don't know when all that happened. The internet is not real specific on the dates. So I don't know how active he was in this recording process, but this particular song is my favorite. I think the fact that it's so early gives me a little extra goodwill towards the beginning. But then after that, we're back into our soundtrack. We're back into the ambient pads and the synthesizers. And I don't know. The sequencing on the album troubles me a little bit. I think that the little instrumental kind of with choirs thing at the very end, they should have started the album with that. I think that would have made a much more interesting introduction than it does a departure from the album. But I like Dance with the Devil a lot. That is easily my favorite track on the album.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. But look, I agree that there's no real rock crunch in the guitars. And I think, as I said, I think there is a definite template over this album that, kind of neuters it a bit, but in the context that it's going to be like a soundtrack, like a show, because they had big plans for this album. It was going to be some sort of multimedia type of extravaganza. So, Pete, I'll throw it over to you. Do you want to spotlight another song? And
I'm going to jump ahead to Believe. And this is one of the tracks that sat sonically and feel a little bit better in my ears. The guitar work on here is more pronounced. I think there's more low end on the track. It feels more polished, a little more complete. And again, let's be fair. I'm probably unjustly viewing them as standalone compositions, and that may be unfair. If it's in a soundtrack setting, you do think of things different. But I am also, and Peter, you and I have talked about these on other shows, I'm a massive fan of soundtracks. And you get the really great ones. I can listen to West Side Story. I can listen to, Magnificent Seven and things and never see the movie and can listen to them in two different genres. Those are, but, be able to listen to them as separate entities of music and composition and form and structure and harmony and melody and enjoy them on that level. I'm not sure these were ever or should have been presented outside with a visual companion. So having said that, I may be doing this unfairly, but this is the only way we can do this. a lot of the drum fills, other than what we had mentioned on the shuffle, there's very, very similar. They're also very similar in tempo. So they do tend to be a little bit monotonous from one track to the next, where it seems like it's a clip and you would have an interlude of movie, come back to the audio clip that stays consistent with where you were before. It doesn't take a huge right turn or anything, because that would be jarring. And so as you're listening to it compositionally from one track to the next, they do start to run together for me. And this is interesting because, and Reed, you're going to laugh. Every time I've heard this, when I keep hearing believe, the only thing that is running through my head is when the heart rules the mind. I'm listening, and we won't make this a show about GTR, but what I'm saying is that type of melodic sense is almost taken to that next level with fuller drums and full composition and full instrumentation on the GTR, that I think works on some levels much more so than they did here. But I don't think they're too dissimilar harmonically and melodically, vocally. It's interesting because the solo that I believe this is John Thomas on guitar on this one. And, I really enjoyed his solo. That was nice and refreshing. It feels more like a song. We have intro, verse, chorus, or pre-chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, a break, good solo, back to the intro. So it's very traditionally composed, and it felt more like a full song. So that's why this one has stood out a little bit to me. I think the chorus is a little cheesy, but it works. It's okay. But I like this one more from top to bottom than many of the ones that have come before it. So.
And do you like the interlude with the soloist, the boy soloist? I think that's kind of has a bit of a gothic feel to it. What do you think of that bit?
It is nice, and it's properly placed. It is put exactly where it should be in the song structurally, and it's beautiful. We get back to the intro, and then we're right back into the song. And not that I was anticipating where it was going to go, but it had a familiarity to it structurally that I could hold on to. It was something I could latch onto and say, okay, I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable here from a composition standpoint, and then the performances do their thing on top of that. So it was more settling to me sonically and auditorily.
Thanks, Pete. Reed, what do you think of Pete's analogy about GTR? I think that's an inspired comparison. I agree with that. It's in a similar sort of wheelhouse.
GTR is a couple of years later, which brings up a really interesting thing. And I also was going to talk about Believe. This was the track where it really started to feel to me like this is meant to be a soundtrack. Even if you don't know that it's a soundtrack, the way it's structured with the call and response, he's got a chorus behind him. It's meant for a stage presentation. And interestingly, this album, even though it sounds exactly like 1985, which this is a frequent thing that it's not even a criticism, it's just an observation. It was what it was. They're using the same drum sound, the gated reverb drum sound that everybody used in the 80s. They're using the same synthesizers that everybody used in the 80s. They're using the same guitar sounds that everybody used in the 80s. This album sounds exactly like Robert Palmer. It sounds exactly like Tina Turner or Robert Plant. Anybody who was doing rock in the mid-80s had these sounds. But just 3 years later, about 1988, this style of music would become massively popular in Japan as soundtracks, because the Japanese, as electronics became more sophisticated, were adding this style of music to video games and to anime. So if you look at shows from 88, 89, if they're going to present a hard rock style band, this is exactly the style of music that they would use. And I look at that and say, 85, it's so weird. You rarely say an album is too early to have better success. But I think this album would have done much better commercially if they had waited 3 years to put it out, because I think it could have been huge in Japan. And even though in America we use that as a joke that you're big in Japan, but you know what? Being big in Japan is not bad. The Japanese buy a lot of media, so if you're big in Japan, you can make a career off of that.
Absolutely.
But they didn't. It came out in 1985. There was no space for this commercially in the United States. But it's okay. One other thing, I'm trying to organize my thoughts. My head's a little messed up today. The fact that it's not Glenn writing the lyrics, and because there are these mystical lyrics, there are these lyrics about occult phenomenon, about the paranormal. If it was Glenn, they would be self-reflective lyrics. He wasn't talking about his higher power yet and doing all of those overcoming adversity songs later. But think about the lyrics on this versus the lyrics on Seventh Star, which he would record just 2 years later.
Right.
Or 1 year later.
Same ballpark.
But I actually think that the lyrics on Phenomena are much more Black Sabbath appropriate than anything that Glenn put on Seventh Star. And in fact, I could almost buy this as a Tony Martin era album if it just had more aggressive guitars on it instead of that ambient pad. It would fit on like a Headless Cross. I could see some of these tracks on Headless Cross if you added some Tony guitar. But it's different hearing Glenn sing somebody else's material, because I never really get the impression that he's all that invested in it. And I went back to look at his autobiography after listening to this album, and I was like, I wonder what he says about it in his autobiography. Nothing. He goes from Hughes Thrall to Gary Moore to Black Sabbath and doesn't even mention this album. So it is, not something that he had much attachment to, certainly after he was done with it.
Yes, because I think he wasn't compensated. There is some bad blood, because he's on record. He'll say he'll never do any Phenomena presentations on stage. And he has done one song. I think he did Still the Night, or Burning Up Japan, which is on YouTube. But you won't see much of Glenn doing any of this material live. So I'm actually doing a meet and greet with Glenn, but I'm a bit nervous if I present this album, he might put it over my head. I'm not sure. It's one of my favorite Glenn Hughes albums. Guys, there was a booklet that came with the album, and they actually did storyboard this with photos. So this was going to be a full-on movie. Very occult. And the song that I'm going to focus on is the storyboard for this is Hell on Wheels. This, to me, is my favorite Glenn Hughes vocal out of all the songs. So, yeah, I probably disagree with you, Reed. I think this has got one of Glenn's finest vocal performances, I mean, against adversity in the 80s. It just goes to see, I mean, if he was cleaned up, how much better his vocals would have been. I listened to this album as a vocal album, and I wrap everything else around that. And that's the thing that sort of keeps me going. But the Hell on Wheels, it's got that sort of driving, propulsive sort of, I don't know, synth line. Another thing that we haven't spoken about is Neil Murray. Neil Murray's bass, the most underrated bass player in hard rock and roll per se. And, his bass lines all the way through this, just push it along, propulse it along. So, you can easily see how a Whitesnake fan would have looked at the cast of characters on this album and said, yes, I've got to get that. But having the first reaction with you, Pete, and going, oh, maybe it isn't Whitesnake, in listening to it. But I really like Hell on Wheels. I just love the drama. I love the lyrics on this particular one, and Glenn sings it with so much conviction. Pete, what do you think of Hell on Wheels?
Yeah, this one is I liked the dual lead intro on it. That was really refreshing and nice to hear. Again, kind of a shuffle, semi-heavy shuffle. I said I'm having troubles connecting with other elements of the song. And I'm, to a fault, self-admittedly. The other thing that is troublesome, not only from what Cozy is or isn't playing, it just doesn't even sound like him. That is not a snare drum sound that Cozy would ever use in any other set of circumstances or situation. And of course, when you're hired to come in and do something, if someone's going to pay you and they said, we want you to use this sound in this way, and by the way, don't do all of these big double-handed double bass things, I want you just to do this and lay down, you go, okay, you sign the check, no problem. But if I hadn't read the liner notes and known that he was in there, I'm telling you, I think 100% of the time I would have had no clue that this was Cozy Powell. None. And he is one of the most distinctive drummers in rock history. You almost always know that it's him. And even if it's just one drum fill, and on the sixth song of some eight-track album or something, you go, it's Cozy. I can pick out something. I couldn't pick out anything that said this is Cozy Powell. And that makes me a bit disappointed and a bit frustrated. Now, it would be highly inappropriate for him to come thundering out the way he does on some records. We talked about at one show the Glenn Tipton album. If he had come out thundering like that on these, it would be highly inappropriate. It's just way over the top. It would not work. Now, it was Cozy, but that's not the point of it. So there has to be a balance somewhere with me, and that balance hasn't connected yet. I'm like, okay, it's him, and I have certain expectations. We all do. If we say someone's on a record, we want to listen to it because we enjoy how that person plays. This could have been anybody. Any of the really other parts could have really just been a whole bunch of unknown studio guys, and it would have made the same impact to me.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Reed.
Hell on Wheels, I really like. I like some of the lyrical callbacks to Ghost Riders in the Sky. There are just a couple of little nudges in there that it's escaping my mind at the second exactly what he says. I like the guitar intro. I thought, if they just beefed up the muscularity of this arrangement a little bit, it could be a UFO track. It has that kind of sound to it. But it is the song that more than any really drove it home to me that this is not a hard rock album. Even though it starts off with a harder rock sound, in fact, the structure on every song, even the ones that figure prominent electric guitar, is the guitar is only really high up in the mix when Glenn is not singing. As soon as the verse starts, the guitar goes way back, probably 9-12 dB. I'm just throwing those numbers out. They don't mean anything.
Softer.
But the guitar gets a lot quieter, and the keyboards become more prominent. Sometimes they actually put the keyboard up over the vocal, which bugs me. But it's the same in every song. It's very consistent, that sound. If there's going to be guitar, it's when Glenn is not singing. And I wouldn't describe it as particularly riffy. You get some guitar lines, and there are a couple of solos, but this is really not like a guitar showcase album. This is Richard Bailey's showcase on keyboards. It's Glenn's showcase vocally. The guitar is it's a spice, and they apply it very, very sparely. But I think it works for most of the material. I have to agree on drums with Pete. You don't hire a name Cozy Powell unless you're using it for advertising value. You say I've got Cozy on the album because you want people to know you've got Cozy on the album. You could hire any session drummer to just do what Cozy is doing on this album. So when you listen to it and go, there's no Cozy on this album. Honestly, if they had taken the drum machine that ZZ Top used on Afterburner, I've been listening to a lot of ZZ Top. If you took the ZZ Top drum machine from Afterburner and put it on this album, I would probably have enjoyed it more. In the drumming department, not the songs overall. But other than that, like Peter keeps saying, it's about the vocals. It's about the synths. And is it this one? Yeah, you actually get piano on this one, electric piano, as well as the synthesizer sound.
But
so it's a good sounding song.
I mean, I lived with this album almost in the day, and I didn't even know Cozy played on it until much later. So a lot of the musicians that played on this album, it was only like subsequent editions that okay, that person was on this album. So it wasn't really marketed and advertised, and maybe that may have been a failing. But I'll put it to you quickly, Pete and Reed. This was advertised and marketed very heavy in the Bible of Kerrang, which is a heavy metal magazine. Mm-hmm. Would this have done better if it was marketed to the Yes folk, the Yes fans, the prog crew? Those that like Big Generator and all that sort of.
I'm thinking, was there really a mechanism for that? I mean, but Big Generator 1 wasn't. 90125 was really the big album. Big Generator was not quite as successful, at least in the US. But all of that was MTV driven. So if they didn't have the money to put together videos, and I can't tell how many times I saw the video for Owner of a Lonely Heart. That song was on constant rotation on MTV, very, very heavy. Right. And there was no video off this album. And this was in 1985.
That's a killer.
When videos were how you did it. It was, as people say, the video MTV at that time is what Spotify is now. It was the world's radio station. So who would they have marketed it to? There were no magazines left that catered to the prog rock people, and they're not taking advantage of the one mechanism that they had. So I do think that trying to go to heavy metal people would be the wrong market, because I can tell you, just thinking back to my own preferences in 1985, I would not have given this album the time. Just not nearly heavy enough. I would have gone, it's not though. Get that out here.
Well, and there's another problem. Artists and their own character and their own style have defined parameters, fair or unfair. You could say, let's market it as a prog thing, but then you were to go through the list of the musicians and go, other than maybe Don Airey at times, there's no prog elements in any of these guys. So how authentic was it going to be? Because wait a second, Cozy, he's a heavy thundering blues drummer. This guy's that. Because now you go in with a different mindset, and you're thinking, if they define it in a marketing standpoint as prog and come in with these very neutered, subdued, simple four on the floor drumming thing, they're going to go, who in the world in the marketing department thought this was prog? And now you're upset because it doesn't match up. That goes back to the very, very first thing that I asked. Who was this marketed for? Let's say, hypothetically, the whole video thing comes along, the whole thing goes to fruition, it becomes a finished product. Pardon me. Who's it geared to? Who is going to watch this? And that's where I'm confused.
Yeah,
I think there is a market for it in the US, especially because you do have those kind of hard rock adjacent bands. Again, like your Aldo Novas, your Robert Palmers, even what Robert Plant was doing. And I think that this would have fit nicely into that space.
AOR.
Yeah, I don't know that there were magazines catering to that.
Yeah.
If there were, I didn't see them. I guess Rolling Stone. I mean,
Yeah.
I've never had much respect for Rolling Stone, at least in terms of music. Sometimes their reporting on non-musical things is okay.
If you see it in, let's say, a Circus or Cream or Hit Parade, or if those are relevant at the time, what would they say? Oh, featuring members of Deep Purple, Whitesnake, such and such. You've now already in your head gone, okay, I have certain expectations, fair or unfair, rational or irrational. And as soon as you put it on and you go, oh, that's not what I thought.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of issues here. So in the UK, American orientated rock or album orientated rock was not a viable thing. Magnum, which Richard Bailey plays keyboards, is AOR, and they're one of the kind of rare exceptions. But bands like Styx, REO Speedwag, and Journey could barely get arrested in the UK. So this is sort of music would have done better in America. But we go to what Reed said. The critical mistake here is there's no video. So, and I can only sort of tie that up that maybe the budget was spent actually recording the damn thing, but not anything left in the kitty to actually put a video. And that's kind of commercial suicide. So they put it through Kerrang. They had this big marketing plans, but they ran out of money. And the most valuable thing, the most viable thing to get your product out into the marketplace was a video, and they didn't get a video. So
and they failed twice here because now 1985 is also as home VCRs and the video rental market is becoming huge. We're starting to see the first of the direct-to-video movies. So if they had succeeded in their multimedia plan where they had done a movie first, not the soundtrack first, but if they had done a movie first and then taken images from that movie to use as the video, which is what every movie after Flashdance, that's exactly how they did it, is you use the video to market the movie and the soundtrack. So you don't let the tail wag the dog, right? You don't start with the least important picture or piece of the picture.
Absolutely. And Tom Galley has said that this album has sold 900,000 copies worldwide. So that's an achievement in itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's not too shabby when it's considered it was a commercial failure. Only hit 63 in the UK charts. Reed, do you want to talk about Who's Watching You?
Okay, so I actually don't really have much to say about Who's Watching You. I think it's an extremely average song. My notes just say perfectly acceptable MTV rock. It kind of went in one ear and out the other. So,
and that's why I connected to this one a little bit more than the others because of what you just said.
I think it's got
fine.
a bit of, yeah, I think it's got a bit of rock crunch. So, Pete, I like this song. I think it's one of the higher top tier songs on the album. And does anyone want to talk about Twilight Zone? That's sort of kind of like a reprise of such, a little bit more positivity in the melody. It's sort of like the finale.
it's got a good guitar solo. And it was a good guitar solo out of it. This is the song that really reminded me of Tony Carey. But this was the song that I went, oh, yeah, this is really in that same vein. And it's right about the same time, in fact. Although, ironically, for a man who's best known as a keyboard player, there's more keyboard on this than there is on Tony Carey's album.
Yeah. Pete?
Twilight Zone. You said Flashdance earlier, and it's funny. And I said in here, it's an outtake from Flashdance, and maybe that's really harsh. But that's what it made me think of. I think the drums on this are probably my least favorite of the record. Glenn is spectacular. He's so good on this. Man, I'd rather just hear the isolated vocal track and just dump everything else and just let me listen to Glenn, because I think he's that good and the rest of the material is that not so good. So that I was not a big fan of this one.
And Reed, Twilight Zone.
Yeah, Twilight Zone. I like it. What was the name of that Tony Carey album? It's going to bug me that I can't remember the name of that. But it really reminded me of that same type of music. And it's right from that same time period. So again, that's not unusual. These guys were from the same area. I mean, was Tony American? Shoot.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're not from the same area. They're from completely different areas. Sorry about that. And he was living in Germany when he recorded that album. Twilight Zone. I like this song. I like the guitar solos. I don't know if that was John Thomas or Mel Galley. Again, the
Thomas.
Credits.
Yeah,
was
John
Thomas? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then he does great work on this. I will say that I've never listened to Budgie. Budgie is another band that had almost no penetration in the U.S. market. If it wasn't for Metallica covering Budgie songs, most heavy metal fans in America would never have heard of them. I guess they were bigger in Canada or something because Martin knew about them. But I like his playing on this album well enough that it makes me want to check out some Budgie records. So that was good, and I'm always glad to hear more guitar because it is such a keyboard-heavy album. And not just keyboard-heavy, but again, near ambient. He's not John Lord playing these flashy lines and concertos and arpeggios. It's pads and sound much more than it is individual notes.
May I ask, do you think this is one of those tracks in a sequencing way that is too far down into the album before it comes out?
No, I think that honestly, and I don't know exactly how the storyline would have gone, but this feels like an end of movie song to me.
Okay.
Kind of a somber mood towards the end. They're in the Twilight Zone. Honestly, I would, if in 1985, I'd have rented this movie. I absolutely would have.
Well, it's got a very occult feel right at the end of this particular, I call it soundtrack. It's like Linda Blair, isn't it?
It looks so much like Linda Blair. I don't know how they didn't get trouble for that.
And that last song, you've got kind of the choral feel to it. It's like the soundtrack to The Omen. Remember The Omen in '76? When anything that was bad was gonna happen, the choir comes out. I think that who did the soundtrack? Jerry. Pete, help me out. Jerry Goldsmith.
Yeah, see, I should know.
Jerry Goldsmith. I think he won an Oscar. Yeah. He won an Oscar for it. But it brought in that sort of choral soundtrack to a lot of horror films. I always take it back to Superstar off the Sabotage album. That sort of sets the template for impending doom and kind of finishes, this album finishes on that sort of note. So I don't mind how it ends. Phenomena. So, Pete, do you want to say some final words and then we'll go to Reed and I'll wrap it up?
I'm glad that I was exposed to it. Would I listen to it much or at all after this assignment? Probably not. I'm not sure repeated listens are going to impact the things that I have my biggest issues with. It's not going to change the sonics of it. It's not going to change a lot of the other things. But you did say something interesting, Pete, because I do it in reverse, and I've done it the way you're thinking about it as well. There are bands that I listen to where I don't care for the singer, but I'll listen to them because the band is just so bloody damn good. And I'll ignore the singer. If I was to repeat this, it would be purely to just enjoy Glenn's singing, and pretty much try to ignore everything else that's around it. Unfortunately for this record, there's so much great Glenn with much better stuff behind it that I can just go to those. So that makes it more difficult. I don't feel it needs a ranking or anything from me. It would just, sound like sour grapes or hurtful or whatever thing, and there's no point in that. It's just not something that attached to me. It's not something that I reached on any emotional level. No goosebumps, no raised hairs on the back of my neck, nothing like that. So that's kind of the indicator I've trusted the most when I'm listening to something, especially repeatedly for a new and see if there's something to latch onto. But I'm a little bit absent in having things that I can put my claws in.
Yeah, and as we all hear things differently, so I really appreciate and respect your opinion on that, Pete.
Thank you.
Thank you. Reed, final thoughts on this album?
Yeah, so again, I like it. If you're a Glenn Hughes completionist, it's well worth owning. Glenn does a fantastic job on it. You just have to bring the right expectations to it. Don't expect a hard rock album. In fact, it's only in the last few years that I have gotten into more keyboard heavy, more ambient sounds. There was a time, especially during the pandemic, where ambient music had this huge swell of popularity among YouTube music, at least, which I don't know why that is, but it's a thing. So I've been exposed to a lot more of that now, and I'm more open to this album now than I would ever have been when I was a teenager. I would not have listened to this back in the day. But now I think it's just fine. I like it better than some of Glenn's solo albums. He has an uneven solo career. Some of his albums are among my absolute favorites, and some of them are just not very good. This one has, again, the benefit of great vocal performance. And other than the fact that it has my least favorite version of Still the Night, it is well worth the Glenn Hughes listen. Just don't expect a hard rock album.
Yeah, thanks, Reed. Thank you. Well, I think it's got Glenn Hughes' finest vocal performance. It's right up there with Hughes and Paul. And I've had a lot of emotional attachment with this album. Got it in the day, and I just love the atmosphere of it. It is very much like a soundtrack, and just turn the lights down, have a glass of red, look outside and look at a storm coming in, and it's the perfect soundtrack to it. There's just, yeah, I just like the breadth of musical, inventiveness on it. I think that they were trying to do something, even though what may have not been commercially successful, but I give it a big tick for trying something different in that particular era. But it's the vocals that centers me in for the listening experience, and everything sort of wraps around it. All right. Thank you, Peter Jones. Wonderful to see you. And I really appreciate your commentary on Rock Daydream Nation and on this show. And Reed Little, as always, wonderful to have you on this show. Folks, tell us what you think of Phenomena. What do you think of Glenn Hughes' vocals? What do you think of the arrangements and the musical performances on this album? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Plenty of shows coming out in 2024. And yeah, see you soon. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter.